Greetings, everybody. I'm Larry Williams, the Director of CARMA, the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, now in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. It is October the 1st, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to another version of our CARMA Quick Chat. And you can find recordings of quick chats that we've done in the past, as well as its predecessor, the Meet the Methodologist interviews on our CARMA YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, karmattu.com. And so with the quick chat, what I like to do is take the opportunity to chat, as the name suggests, with people who are making important contributions. And so today, we're very excited that I have this opportunity to do this with Bert Weijters. And Bert is at Ghent University, and his webcast is October the 18th, and I'll let him describe what he's going to be talking about in a few minutes, but I want to learn more about Bert and the stuff that he does. So let's start, Bert, with the first question about how is it that you ended up becoming a professor?
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, I've always been interested in research, even as a student. And I remember when I did my master's dissertation, I was studying biomotives for about in the coffee market, more specifically looking into why do people buy fair trade or why don't they? And when I got into running the surveys and collecting data on the street, talking to respondents, it struck me that a lot of the information that I got from those respondents was probably more noise than substance. And I really, at that point, dove into the literature on response styles dating like way back to the early 20th century and discovered all kinds of classic research that got me really interested in digging deeper, reading more. And I think at that point, I realized that research was really my thing. And afterwards, when I graduated from psychology, I did an additional master in marketing management. And there too, I felt that a lot of the consumer insights that we get are not as straightforward as they seem, and that a lot of the data that we work with is not like something you can take at face value. And I always got into analyzing stuff in more depth. And when we did team assignments, I typically ended up being the guy who did the number crunching. So research was really my thing. When I graduated from marketing management as well, there were some vacancies for researchers, and that was basically a great fit right from the start. I had a lot of autonomy. Started working in a management school, Florida Business School, and I got a lot of autonomy. Could collect my own data, present it to companies, try to get publications from it, and there I decided to do my PhD, focusing on survey methods. And afterwards, there were some vacancies again, and I quickly could get an assistant professor position at this management school, and later moved to Ghent University to focus even more on research rather than teaching and working with companies.
Yeah. So if I may throw in a question that wasn't on the list. So if I'm guessing correctly, your interest in response styles kind of emerged at the same time that SEM was really gaining interest and visibility within the quantitative sciences. And so that must have created this natural opportunity for you to link your interest in confirmatory modeling with response styles. Is that kind of how it happened?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, when I was doing my master dissertation, that was back in 1999, I guess. I just used non-SEM methods to analyze it. But then afterwards, when I started my PhD, I started following courses in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and the US, doing a lot of video courses. Um, Back then, I was still using Amos, then gradually switched to M Plus and got to know later on still Lavan. And it all made a lot of sense at the time to me that um, the relation between variables was pretty complicated, and SEM was really the way to model that correctly.
Uh,
And it was really eye-opening to me that you could kind of model complex relations between observed variables, and from that derive or make conclusions about latent constructs, and at the same time account for measurement error that is random and measurement error that is more systematic. So it all kind of fit together extremely well. And the things that I experienced as a master student, collecting data from actual respondents, talking to them, and realizing like at times they just said something random, or they gave some comments about the questions that made it clear to me that if you just sit behind your computer and look at a data set, there's a lot in there that you don't see just in the numbers as they are. And there's a
Yeah.
lot going on in the minds of your respondents that you not necessarily capture if you just take it at face value. So I think that like things like having method factors, correlate residuals, and measures, explicit measures of social desirability bias of response styles, was something that works very well in structural equation model framework, but not in the more, well, I would say less sophisticated models. So I guess a survey psychology, or just psychology of survey respondents, and structural equation modeling as a very natural fit
Yeah.
that for me was like very motivating to work with.
Yeah. Excuse me. Well, it, again, given my natural interest, I can't resist another question, which is, so for methods people with our kinds of interest in measurement processes, I think that there aren't very many people who involve both the use of experimental design in their methodological research. It's more of, and if they do experimental design, it's in the design of their simulation. But that's not true of your work, right? So can you give an example of how you involve an experimental manipulation in investigating an interest in a response style?
Um, yeah, I basically started doing experimental survey research where we manipulated things like the way you ask a question or the
Mm-hmm.
scale format you used to rate it. Back in the days when I was doing my doctoral research, my supervisor was Maggie Geuns, who's in marketing at the time, together with Niels Schillewaard. And Niels also started up a market research agency back in the, yeah, it must have been like 25 years ago approximately. And they were one of the first to go online at a massive scale. So they went for
Mm-hmm.
online data collection. And they were kind of both struggling with what was new and also very much interested in exploring what were the possibilities. And he was really open to setting up experiments like with the way you ask questions. What is the effect of using negations, reversals? What is the difference between a 5, 6, or 7 point scale in
Mm-hmm.
terms of response styles? And we could just play around and see what happens because we were collecting data anyway for this market research. And then I could always attach a bunch of nonsensical questions or random questions to just see what happens. So that was great to be able to do that. And then later on, I'm also naturally interested in language and the way people formulate things and understand or misunderstand the way we as researchers formulate questions. And that's also at a point something that took me a bit um, in other directions. Like we once did a study on what meaning do people attach to words and their negations. More specifically, what's the difference between something not being cheap and something being expensive, and how does negation come into play there? And it's not necessarily the case that not good not bad doesn't not necessarily mean good, and not good
Mm-hmm.
typically does mean bad. So there's all kinds of things going on there, and we've done some experiments there where you try to experimentally compare price perceptions of these different terms. So I basically started by playing around with manipulations in questions, in question formats, and rating scale formats, but then also went a bit beyond that and ran some other experiments as well.
Yeah.
And it always struck me that especially in marketing, we have almost two different subcultures, like the consumer behavior people, the CB people. They do experiments the whole time, and
Uh-huh.
they basically never use structural equation modeling for some reason. I don't know why. So they're very much trained to do very clean experiments and analyze it with ANOVAs.
Yeah.
And then you have the more management-oriented people who do surveys and structural equation modeling. And somehow the two don't often cross-fertilize
Yeah.
each other's methods, literatures. So I think there's a wide gap there. And I think CB people and other experimentalists could get a lot more out of their data if they would focus more on the measurement aspect.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's and to me it's sort of interesting. We were talking earlier about my first book being Rick Bogosi's book in
Yeah,
1980, and it has a chapter on SEM with experimental data, as does I think David Kenny's classic kind of 1979 correlation and causality book. I think it's because the real interest is the real issue is that people, the experimental people, their interest is solely on internal validity,
mhm,
and measurement is just a necessary step along the way, you
yeah,
know. And whereas then this other side, the real interest is measurement, and they're just correlating everything, and they don't have the same type of interest in
mhm.
internal validity. Well, from all this time, what do you think? What are the main things we know about response styles? As somebody
Um,
who's watched it and been involved in that literature.
yeah, yeah. Well, what kind of was one of the surprising findings throughout the years to me was how surprisingly stable a lot of these response styles are, both throughout the course of a questionnaire. So, measuring like the extent of extreme responding in the beginning of a questionnaire pretty strongly correlates with extreme responding at the end. But more surprisingly, also over longer periods of time, like weeks, months, and even years. I didn't expect that at the time. So they're pretty stable. And you could say, yeah, that's obvious because part of them is explained by social demographics like age, education level, um, and by consequence they should be stable. Well, but the explained variance there is really small, so that's not the only reason why they're stable. So I think they're pretty stable and pervasive. They're basically in all the data that we collect where a respondent is involved, there is some aspect of them. So that's the first thing I find really not surprising anymore now, but when I first saw the results and read other papers of people finding the stability, that was came as a surprise to me. Especially because a lot of survey researchers kind of assume that as soon as there's a time gap between measures, any common method variance should be
Yeah.
given, which is not the case.
Yeah.
And the second one is that they're much more complicated than one might assume um, from an outside perspective, in that you can basically think of response styles as disproportionately using certain response categories or response levels. And it would be nice if all that would boil down to having a different central tendency across respondents. So some people are a bit more positive, some are negative, but that's only part of the picture. Some people use the midpoint a lot, some use the endpoints a lot,
Hmm.
some really use the moderate agreement
Hmm.
disagreement categories a lot. So anything goes, and we try to bring structure to that by putting some labels on some styles, but basically any scale format has its own different potential styles that people can use them. So they're very nuanced and complex, especially when it comes to the whole reversed item debate. I'm still not able to get my head around what is going on there. Like people are so inconsistent in answering questions that are like, it's sunny outside. It's not sunny outside. Even that seems to be problematic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and it's so fascinating that negations are not quite the same as antonyms. And even if you find the perfect antonym, the perfect reversed item, somehow people get it wrong. And it's partly inattention, it's partly cognitive problems with processing negations and reversals. It's also partly differences in response styles. So it's a really complicated and interesting psychological phenomenon there.
Yeah. Yeah, I got interest in reverse scoring items literally 40 years ago when I was in
Yeah.
graduate school. And because this guy Neil Schmidt was one of the earlier, he was a management person and he was one of the earliest to get involved in it. And as I started learning more and thinking about it more, what really puzzled me was this assumption that the adjustment that people make cognitively as they switch the direction matches the recoding
Yeah,
capabilities,
it
So,
doesn't. Yeah.
well, so is all of that what led to your interest then in within person SEM, kind of the stability of those response styles?
Um, my interest for within subject experimentation actually comes from marketing as well as from my interest in how stable or variable or how response styles evolve over the course of a questionnaire. So it's kind of a mix. But in marketing, I got really fascinated by rating-based conjoint analysis,
Mhm.
where you show people a bunch of products with experimentally manipulated attributes, and they rate the attractiveness or the intention to buy, which turned out to be exactly the same as policy capturing, basically, although the two literatures are totally isolated, and also the same basically as factorial surveys in sociology. Um, and I felt that the conjoint literature, specifically in marketing, has kind of developed on its own in a direction that is very technical, but also inaccessible to a lot of researchers. And it's kind of something that is a world on its own. And when looked at some conjoint data, I felt like it would probably make sense to use structural equation modeling to analyze it. And that's how we came up with the structural equation modeling for within subjects, the Semwise approach, together with Hans Baumgartner. And I feel that the whole within subjects kind of data is very rich on the one hand, very has a lot of statistical power, but it also contains a lot of unwanted effects like consistency, memory effects, common method, all kinds of carryover and other regressive effects. So I think that's a nice sandbox to try out all kinds of modeling approaches with regards to how do item responses correlate to each other for reasons other than the substantive content that they're trying to measure.
Yeah.
So there too, it was kind of a mix of some applied context like conjoint analysis that is often used in marketing research, and the need to understand and model all kinds of psychological effects that are at play when people respond to questions.
Yeah. So I want to take the opportunity to ask you two more questions that are kind of near and dear to my heart because they're topics that I'm interested in and work
Mm-hmm.
in. And the first one concerns the use of parcels, where a researcher who has a desire typically to reduce the number of items that go into their measurement model will combine items to form indicators, what we refer
Mm-hmm.
to as parcels. And it's sort of controversial. And so I'm wondering where you're at on that continuum.
I think I have a pretty balanced view on that, but I guess most people say that about their own views.
Not really. I've encountered some that are way at the extreme.
Okay. But I think that it basically depends on what you're interested in your data. And if the question is, what does my um, multi-item scale look like in terms of dimensionality, factor structure, then we should definitely not use parceling, because then part of what you're interested in is kind of averaged away. So if you're doing scale construction or you want to understand how reversed items relate to non-reversed
Mhm.
items, or which item does load strongly, which doesn't, and why, then you have to use the individual items in my personal view. Um, on the other hand, if you're interested in the construct that you're measuring, the indicators are a means to an end, in
Yeah.
my view. And then parceling can be helpful because it helps you focus on the construct instead of the indicators. And then especially with situations like where you have reversed items that are causing all kinds of trouble, which they always do,
Mhm.
then we found that bringing together in one parcel a bunch of non-reversed items with a bunch of reversed items helps you average out the acquiescence and
Yeah,
misresponse. So
yeah,
then it's really, I think, really neat and useful to use it
yeah,
because it helps you focus on the structural part of the model, because the measurement part then kind of tends to have a better fit, tends to be a bit more normally distributed,
yeah,
so much cleaner and crisper to work with.
yeah, yeah. So the next question, there's probably nothing, no particular limitation of research that's more infrequently invoked than the problem of common method variance. And so, do we have any good, but the reality is we're going to be always using surveys.
Mm.
So, do we have any good solutions to common method variance?
Well, I think I might be in line with one of the papers I think you co-authored, where you said something like it's it's everywhere. It's problematic. It's hard to fix, something along those lines.
Yeah,
Don't know the exact words.
that was my title, by the way. So,
Okay, I love the title. I should memorize it better because it's a nice tagline to open like
yeah,
a presentation about that. Yeah, I think it's very pervasive and hard to fix. Um, and I don't think we can ever get rid of it in survey data. Um, that's why I think it's interesting to try to combine survey data with other measures, and that becomes
mhm,
increasingly easy to
yeah,
do, like eye tracking even via webcam, or tracking how people use their
yeah,
mouse, even maybe some biochemical measures or other neural measures. So that's one thing. Different types of data can help us understand what's going on, I think. Different respondents, so multi-rater information can be helpful. But in the end, usually the respondent is the only one who knows everything. Like if we're measuring personality, the respondent is the only one who's there in every situation that is relevant. So they have unique information, so we cannot just throw that away. So that makes it impossible to totally get rid of it in survey data. But I think like um, trying to understand the psychology of the survey response is the key to better understanding, modeling, and correcting for common method variants, I think, because
mhm,
if we know that some people just agree with whatever you ask them, you can simply include some reversed items. If you know that people sometimes just want to make a good impression, you probably want to include a control variable that kind of captures,
mhm,
to some extent, it's very difficult, social desirability bias. So I think carefully think about what kind of distortions are likely to occur for this respondent in this situation is really key. And then trying to prioritize the most important sources of common method bias and variance, and try to um, kind of get rid of them in the design. If that's not possible, try to control for them in the measurement and in the modeling is probably the best we can do. But I don't see like a silver bullet solution
yeah, yeah.
there.
Well, as I indicated at the beginning, one of the reasons we're chatting with you is because on October the 18th, you're going to be doing a webcast. For those watching this who may not be so familiar with what we do, Karma has an institutional membership program. We deliver live webcast lectures every year. And the recordings of those go into a video library. We have an institutional membership model where universities join, and all faculty and students at the university get access to the live lecture as well as the recordings. We started in doing the recordings in 2004. So that means we have over 250 webcast lectures that people have access to. And one of the things we're doing again this year is we are on any given webcast day, we're actually offering two of them. One, our traditional one, starts at 12 Eastern time in the US, and it's mainly for the people in the Western Hemisphere. but we've also started an earlier series that is at 9 Eastern time, and we do that earlier start particularly for those in the Eastern Hemisphere and all of our colleagues and supporters in Europe. And so, Bert, you're going to be joining us early on the early set in a couple of weeks, October the 18th, and you're going to be talking about SEM and experimental data. So, or the analysis of experiments, something with a rich history, but clearly been neglected. So, can you give us a preview of what you're going to be talking about?
Okay, yeah, great. Um, the idea is basically to kind of try to cross the gap between experimental researchers and structural equation modelers, in that I feel that a lot of experimental data um, could benefit from being analyzed with structural equation modeling to get the measurement aspect right. Um, so I think even in simple between subject experiments, there would be benefit in trying to control for measurement error, both random and systematic, and it would help improve statistical power. So that's one thing. Also, I think there's a few chapters and papers out there discussing how you can use SEM for experimental research. I think there's still some room for coming up with some suggestions of how to look at simple effects, like to use a two-group model for two conditions, or to use an observed variable as an antecedent of your outcome. What are the benefits or one of one or the other? If you use a two-group model or a three-group model, if you have more conditions, should you measure for measurement invariance? How do you do that? So that's a between subjects part. Then there's an important discussion about mediation going on, because a lot of people run experiments, but then use mediation models and then still act as if the mediation data is experimental, which it is not. It's just
Yeah.
correlational data. So there, especially, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings, and it would be welcome to think about common method variants in that setting, and give some ideas about how to optimize measurement and data analysis to account for that and correct for that if possible. And then third, there's the within subjects experiments like policy capturing, conjoint analysis, factorial surveys, where you can get much deeper insights with structural equation modeling, because instead of looking at the effects in a within subject setting as something that you want to estimate at the aggregate level, in structural equation modeling, you can really try to model those effects as individual variables, individual latent variables. For instance, if you would ask people to rate CVs in a screening task, um, the extent to which a assessor takes into account, say, nationality or is biased by it, could be an individual difference variable that you want to explain with some antecedents or moderators. And I think structural equation modeling gives a lot of opportunities there that are currently not used to their fullest extent, I think.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what it will be about.
Oh, well, that sounds great. We were talking earlier about how the adoption of SEM for experimental methods has been slow. Part of that could be that just getting how you used to have to twist the software packages around to be able to get them to do this type of analysis. So now that the mechanics that way are a lot simpler in most cases, there's a great space for a paper a presentation that's going to do what you described. So again, that'll be October the 18th, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern time. Bert Weijters, it's been great to chat with you, man. Appreciate you taking the extra time. This took about twice as long as what I thought it would be, but I really enjoyed it and appreciate your contribution. We'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks so much. It was great talking to you.